So Lineker, if we go back there, has almost, it seems, I don't know, challenged the BBC. Yesterday he publicly declared that he will appear on Match of the Day on Saturday, despite the ongoing row over that social media thing. The presenter suggested that his anti-government tweets were his business. Yes, he compared it to Nazi Germany, and people are up in arms. Suella Braverman, he says, storm in the teacup. However, it is said this morning, and we could be wrong, that insiders at the corporation don't know what to do, because free speech is one thing, but he's gone too far. But he's such a big star that it would be wrong to do anything. To talk more about this is, I love this lady, campaign director of Defund the BBC, Rebecca Ryan. Welcome to Talk Breakfast. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm all right. It's weird. It's a weird feeling when you get into the 9 o'clock hour, because we've been up since about 4. Gary Lineker, speak to me. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Gary Lineker essentially he's a troll, isn't he? That's what he is. He's no better or worse than Donald Trump, really. But he'd like everybody to think that he's virtue signaling, that he's, sort of elevated to the level of the gods. But what he is a troll. And generally, you don't have to pay for trolls. But the thing is with the BBC, and it's taxing of people who simply want to watch live TV, not just BBC, but, any other live broadcast TV, is in order for them to be able to hit up the British public for that, they have a charter, which means that they are obliged to produce content that is unbiased, that is representative of all parts of the UK, and that is unifying. And that's the key word that I think everybody's missing from the charter, is that it's unifying. But Gary Lineker and his trolling, he's just divisive. He's clearly biased. He's done this over and over again.
What do you say, though? What do you say? If I take Piers' view, and I'm with you, Rebecca, right? And I think unifying, I haven't heard that this week, and I think that's a really interesting thing. I'll ask you about a couple of programmes in the pipeline in just a tick. Let's talk about the argument that says that we are a democracy. Free speech is at the very essence of who we are as a country and people. He made those comments on Twitter. He did not make them on air. Why is he not entitled to have his opinion, whether you agree with it or not, and I don't? Why is he not entitled to have that on Twitter and keep his job on the BBC?
I mean, this is pure gaslighting from Gary Lineker, because he knows full well, which is why he does this, that Twitter isn't just some small corner of the internet. Twitter dictates the news cycle. The reason we're talking about this over and over again is because people are outraged, because it has reached every single corner of the UK, because the mainstream media pick up what's happening on Twitter. So it's completely ridiculous to sort of say, oh, this is just a little tweet that I put out on, this little social media platform. I don't know what all the hoo-ha's about. That's pure gaslighting from Gary Lineker.
When you sign a contract, you would know far more than me. I mean, I'd never been near the BBC. I wouldn't want to. When he signed a contract, Robin, my mate in Newcastle, says surely that contract would have said you have to be impartial, and he's broken that. Is that true? Because if that's the case, why aren't his bosses coming out and criticising him, or at least making him apologise? Are they scared of him, or does it in fact suit the rhetoric that they want out there, because they're all left-wing loonies anyway?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know the specifics of his actual contract, but the point is that the BBC has this obligation, in order for it to keep the TV licence, it has an obligation to be impartial and to be unifying. And Gary Lineker is their top paid star. The British public are paying him $1.35 million a year. And it doesn't really matter about the terms of his personal contract or what have you. It's about the BBC and the platform that the BBC has given to Gary Lineker. And he knows full well exactly what he's doing. And the reason that he'll get such a huge kickback from every little tweet that he puts is because he is the biggest paid star of the BBC, and because the BBC is funded by British taxpayers. And I think, it's all very well. If the BBC aren't going to punish him, that's great, because actually Gary Lineker is our greatest spokesperson at Defund the BBC. Every time he says something like this, we get people come rushing to us to find out how they can stop paying the BBC. And
people are saying that the way to get rid of this whole thing is to boycott Match of the Day, but I would suggest that people do not, whatever Gary Lineker might tell us, watch the Match of the Day for Gary Lineker. They watch it for the football. It is an interesting argument. Rebecca, if we can take it further, you were talking about the BBC and its charter. Couple of things. You mentioned unifying content, unbiased, but that word unifying jumped out at me, because we were doing this on JK Live this week. Couple of programmes. One... Yeah. Bill Cosby, that documentary with that horrendous woman, literally said, talking about sex with, I don't know if you saw the part, she was talking, I mean, I'm not even going to go into it. It was graphic and it was completely and utterly wrong. And also, you look at the Jimmy Savile bio that Steve Coogan filmed that's been on the shelf for 2 years. Even victims have come out and said this is completely disgraceful. People are now saying his relationship with the now king, that's why it's being shelved. Are you telling me that a documentary on a vile paedophile, Jimmy Savile, or a documentary about Cosby and sexual abuse with some sex therapist saying, and don't quote me on this, but it was about sex with people who aren't conscious. It was absolutely outrageous. Are you telling me that that's unifying content and I want to be paying for that?
Exactly. I mean, the BBC are literally scraping around in the darkest corners of the internet looking for people with these extreme views. And like you say, that isn't unifying. It's not representative. And, you know, they have this obligation in order so that they can go around and say to people, if you're watching any live broadcast TV, if you're watching Sky Sport, if you're watching ITV as it's broadcast, then you have to pay us. And this is a tax on the British people. And people know now how you can get out of it. If you're watching catch up and on demand, you don't have to pay the BBC. But the thing is, what the BBC needs to realise, if they want to make that kind of content, well, that's fine. If they can find an audience out there that's willing to voluntarily pay for it.
Well, then we come to it. Should the BBC be a subscription service? Is that what you, Rebecca, and the Defund the BBC is arguing for? Because if that's the case, I wonder, it would be interesting to see whether anybody would actually bloody well watch it. But you'd at least be saying to people, you can make that choice rather than being told you have to pay this money or you can't watch anything and we'll tell you what you're going to watch.
Absolutely, or be funded by advertising. I mean, it's not really for us to say how they should be funded. That's up to them how they think they can get a paying audience that wants to pay for them, and whether that's subscription, which is the way a lot of broadcasters are going, then that's absolutely fine. But that's down to them. But the main thing is they're producing content and coming out with views and pushing an agenda that the majority of British people don't agree with. And therefore, they can't go around bullying vulnerable people on their doorsteps and forcing them to pay the product that they just do not want.
Listen, I really, really appreciate it. Somebody just said to me, oh, Richie's arrived in Paris. I don't care if he's arrived in Paris, unless he's got his checkbook out, and then I'll get very angry. What do you think out on the streets, Rebecca? Seriously, what is the feeling about defunding the BBC? Is it an opinion that's gathering popularity, or is there mass support for the BBC, or is your organisation tracking? What's the situation?
Yeah, so you know, we see a huge amount of people are cancelling their TV licences. Every time Gary Lineker says something like this, we get a huge influx of people asking us how they can, what their rights are, what they can get away with watching without paying. You know, people are really, really cross, and this has built up over years. You know, particularly emphasised by the BBC's coverage of Brexit. We had during Brexit, people who voted for it were painted as racist, and too old, and basically hanging around too long. There was a lot of really horrendous views that were being put forward and given a platform by the BBC. So that feeling has grown over those years. And now, every time the BBC takes a step wrong, we get a huge influx of people as supporters and finding out how they can cancel their TV licence. So the BBC can carry on with its head in the sand, and it just hurries along its demise, because more and more people are realising that if you watch on demand and catch up, as long as it isn't BBC iPlayer, you don't need a TV licence. So you don't have to pay for this. And it's just the way that people are consuming content now anyway. So it's just going to hurry it along.
And actually, just to finish it off, we started with Lineker, and I think this is a really salient point. Other television presenters have lost their jobs because of, their freedom of expression. Our own Piers lost his job at ITV because he called Meghan Markle a liar. Is he entitled to that opinion? Absolutely. We know what happened there, right? Clarkson, yes, many will say, quite rightly, that the tone of the article was wrong, and I would agree with that. But it's how you define freedom of speech. Gary Lineker winds people up, right? Because he looks smug when he's doing it, and he seems to come from that position where I'm doing fine, but I'm going to spend my entire life moaning about how unfairly people less fortunate than me are treated. Well, give your money away, Gary. That's just my opinion. But I think the chat about the BBC is interesting, Rebecca, and I don't think it goes away. I think that people will shine a light ever strongly on it, and I think that's a good thing. And I really, really appreciate you being on the show this morning. Rebecca Ryan from the Defund the BBC campaign.